Good morning, everybody. So, as you can see, today we're going to continue our exploration of nyoho clothing, nyoho-e. So one of the reasons that we are focusing on nyoho clothing at Sanshin is, of course, that our direct ancestor, Kodo Sawaki, was one of the leaders of the 20th century nyoho movement to teach and wear this kind of robe. So understanding this kind of practice is an important element of our family style. So last week I was talking pretty abstractly, dharma and robe are one. This week it's very concrete. So let's sort of dig into the history of that. And again, for me, there's always a question of why do we practice today the way we practice today. So this history is important. So of course, Okumura Roshi's teacher was Uchiyama Roshi. Uchiyama Roshi's teacher was Kodo Sawaki, so this is only 2 generations back. This history is only 2 generations back. So there are various biographical accounts of Sawaki Roshi in English floating around that talk about his war service and his teaching career in his early days and all of that. I encourage you to find those things and read them. We don't have time to do all of that today, but they're out there. And again, it's important, I think, as one of our main 20th century ancestors that we kind of know that story. So today I'm going to focus specifically on his involvement with nyoho-e and his leadership with that movement. So before I can tell that story, of course, we need to back up, understand the context of discussions within Japanese Buddhism about what robes should look like. And this is an old and long-standing conversation, right? So there was a reform movement in the 17th century that aimed to get all the robes to more closely match the ancient monastic rules, the Vinaya. So this was mostly a study of texts. But there was a Shingon teacher named Jiyun Onko who also studied artworks, statues, paintings, studied old antique robes themselves to see how they were made and what they looked like. So Sawaki Roshi would later do that as well, looking at statues mainly to see how things were made, how were they worn, rather than relying only on written descriptions or only on the texts. So Jiyun Onko taught his own students to make robes according to the Vinaya, and he also used those old robes as models. So the reformers originally expected that across Japanese Buddhism there would be some continuity of robes. Even though the individual sects, the individual schools were each doing their own practice and foregrounding the things that they thought were important and keeping their own style, reformers were still thinking that, in the midst of that, there would be some continuity, some shared understanding about robes. But by the mid-18th century, we see sectarianism kind of increasing. That's becoming more forceful, more prevalent. Reformers become subsets within their own schools. So whatever your school was, within that school there would be a little committee, a little group of reformers. So figuring out exactly what the Vinaya said about robes was not that easy. You couldn't just go to that text and open it up and go, oh, that's it. Figuring out what that meant was not so easy. So folks had to reconcile 2,000 years of history and context and teachings and practice culture to decide what a nyoho-e really was. So even so, Jiyun Onko went on working for this consistent robe across the sects. He and his followers decided to make 1,000 robes according to the Vinaya. So imagine this project. I mean, we know what it takes to make one of these. For our own, even a raksu, right? For our own ceremony. They decided they're going to make 1,000 robes according to the Vinaya. It took them 40 years. Can you imagine? Sewing mainly was done by nuns and lay women, and they undertook this massive project. So the scope of this project means people really got to dig into and understand okesa, how you make them, where they come from, how you wear them, and to really be inspired by that. There's some real bodhicitta arising out of that activity. So in the 18th and 20th centuries then, the Soto school went to work to reconcile all of that with Dogen's teachings. Now we have another whole element, we have another whole layer. How do we reconcile all of that with the Vinaya and the study and all that, like with what Dogen taught and with what Dogen did? So these are really important questions because in other schools, like Shingon, Jiyun Onko's school, the Vinaya were the source of authority. You went to the Vinaya to say yes, no, right, wrong, this was how we do it, right? In Soto Zen, of course, the Vinaya, the later monastic rules are important, but Dogen is the major source of authority. And there's a lot of history around that, which I encourage you to read, right? So how do we reconcile these things? We've got more than one potential source of authority. So if there were disagreements between what Dogen said, or what Dogen did, and the Vinaya, then the integrity of Soto Zen as an institution is jeopardized, right? We can't have these things arguing with each other. So how do we reconcile these things? So in his writings, Dogen says, well, the true robe, hasn't actually been introduced to Japan yet. He says this is even though he's surrounded by people wearing robes. He says the true robe isn't actually here yet. His point is that all of these people are wearing robes, but they don't really understand yet how to make them, how to wear them, how to take care of them. They don't know about materials or color or size, right? Taishi Kiryo, or what these things mean for our practice. So there's lots of robes floating around, but they're not well understood. So he starts with the Vinaya and the precepts and starts adding his own interpretations and his own teachings, and he teaches about the robe that doesn't have physical characteristics. And this is a bit we were talking about last week, right? The robe that's not a physical robe. So this, he says, this robe without characteristics is the true robe. So he also fills in some gaps with forms and rituals, and this is important because of his teachings about the robe and the dharma, or the robe and the Buddha, being one, as we talked about last time. So how we treat the robe is how we treat the Buddha, right? So when you receive your rakusu or your robe and you're taught, you carry it up here and you don't put it on a shoe shelf and you don't wear it in the bathroom, right? How we treat the robe is how we treat the dharma, or how we treat Buddha. So also, of course, he equates transmission of the robe with transmission of the dharma. So this robe is not just an everyday garment. It's not just something we make and put on to cover ourselves or to signify something, right? It's not just an everyday thing. So Dogen is interpreting the Vinaya and the older teachings. And when the 18th century reform movement comes along in Soto Zen, then the reformers are interpreting Dogen. So look at all the interpretations that are happening here, right? We've got the Vinaya and the interpretations and the studies and the interpretations of that, and we add Dogen, and look at how complicated this thing becomes. So again, reformers want to return everything to the old Soto Zen ways, based on Dogen and based on Keizan. They want to push out these influences that have crept in from other schools of Buddhism, from misunderstandings of the practice, right? They want to get it all corrected. So this is the return, kind of a return to the old ways movement. So this is where we get to talk about the ring, the blessed ring. So I've got here Esho's rakusu with a ring. And probably you've seen one like this. So here she has, this is the commercially made rakusu with the ring, which is not what you typically will see in the Zendo here at Sanshin, right? So lots of people in the West, I think, have questions about the ring. Why don't we wear a ring? Why don't we make a robe with a ring? What about the ring? So now we get to talk about the ring. So the ring is about how ancient, okay, so we're fastened. So all of this has to do with how did we fasten these robes? And there's lots of little elements and rivulets about how do we fasten these robes. So there was a hook and a ring. And that's the remnant here, the ring on the rakusu, right? So today, this is typically a set of fabric ties, or a fabric loop and a tie, or in this case, a couple of cords. In the case of the commercial, it's a couple of cords, right? So there isn't the ring and the hook today, at least in Soto Zen. In the old days in China, that ring was sometimes pretty elaborate. It was carved. It might be made out of something expensive, particularly like a fancy brocade robe, right? This was an ornamental element of this robe. So instead of a hook, there was a cord, and that cord could also be expensive. Maybe that cord was silk or braided or embroidered or embellished in some way, right? So we can see the ring and the cord in the ancient portraits of pictures. If you go look at really old paintings, you can, it's why people were looking at these paintings to say, how are these robes made, worn, fastened, right? Sometimes you can see the fastening here. So what kind of fastening you have affects how the robe hangs, of course, right? So if you have a ring and a hook, then the front corner hangs down and it makes this impressive kind of drapery. So you've probably got a really nice fabric, you've got lots of fabric, you've got this drapery hanging down the front. If you don't have a ring, then the corner gets tucked up in the back, which is why we wear these like we do, right? So we can see why nyoho proponents might start to have a problem with this, right? Because you could look at this ring with the fancy, expensive, this robe with the fancy, expensive ring. It's carved, it's made of something impressive, it's metal on a fancy fabric robe, and say, well, that's all about impressing people. It's all about showing the high status of people, of Soto Zen or people within Soto Zen, clergy, temples, whatever. So there's a lot of technical discussion about whether this can be a closed ring, should it be simply a sort of a bent metal fastener, what kind of metals are allowed. There's a lot of conversation about materials that goes with this. So one point of view emerges. It says rings are not appropriate for any kind of Soto Zen robe at all. They should all be gone because they don't adhere to the Vinaya, to the rules, the Vinaya rules. But then there's this larger question about, well, so does a robe that violates the rule, is a robe that violates the rules still Buddhist robe? So now we've got like who decides what the rules are, right? And then, well, if this thing is, this robe that's in front of me is not exactly according to Vinaya, according to rules, is it still Buddha's robe? Which I think is a really interesting question. I think Sawyer and I had a conversation about that sometime back with Cone, right? If this thing is not made according to nyoho, is it still Buddha's robe? Which is an interesting question, which you can answer more than one way. Okay, so the Vinaya are Buddha's rules, so doesn't breaking Buddha's rules make this thing not a real robe? And also, there's Dogen's teaching that says the true robe doesn't have characteristics, so simply, this true robe is simply the transmission of the dharma. So if that's the case, then you can't really devalue a non-conforming robe. How can there be a robe which is not Buddha's robe, right? So all of this is swirling around, partly touched off by this question about the ring. What do we do about the ring? So in the early 1800s, the government required all the sects to identify the particular characteristics of their robes. There was really an effort to say, what does this sect look like? What does this sect do, right? To try to differentiate, right? So all the sects had to describe what were the particular characteristics of their robes. Soto Zen had to decide how to distinguish itself from Rinzai and from Obaku, right? So the document that Soto Zen produced lays out materials, colors, what different ranks could wear what different things. It also said clergy could wear rakusu, as well as okesa. So we don't really know the origin of rakusu. It's not mentioned in the Vinaya. It's prevalent here. We see it all the time. So interesting that this was like the first time that anybody had said, oh, it's okay for clergy to wear rakusu. So some people say it's an abbreviated okesa. So if you look at this, this is a 5-panel. If you look at this carefully, it looks like a miniature 5-panel okesa, right? Because it has the 5 rows. So there were folks who just said, that's a miniature okesa. There are, so it shows up, other people say this is a completely Chinese invention. This is a completely Chinese thing. This was not like Buddha's 5-panel okesa. So it first shows up in Japan during the Kamakura period, which is roughly Dogen's time, right? So this is not an ancient Indian garment. Ultimately, we don't really know what Dogen's robes were like. It's a bit hard to tell from his portraits. He didn't leave specific instructions about how do you sew these things or what they should look like. So those who are arguing for or against the ring don't have the evidence to say, well, this is what Dogen did. This is what he wrote. This is what his, we have no photographs. We don't really know. So if you're arguing for the ring, you have to prove somehow that Dogen was wearing one. And if you're arguing against the ring, you have to prove somehow that he wasn't wearing one. And that becomes not possible, right? So you can see why this is a big controversy. So you may know Sotoshu has 2 head temples. It has Eihei-ji and it has Sojiji. Eihei-ji is Dogen's place. Sojiji is Keizan's place. They're both considered founders of Soto Zen, Dogen and Keizan. So in the mid-1800s, Eihei-ji is arguing against the ring and says, and also, by the way, Sojiji should stop wearing the ring. Well, of course, Sojiji's not happy. Doesn't want Eihei-ji telling it what to do. This is also a time when Eihei-ji was positioning itself as the sole head temple because it was Dogen's place, and Dogen's writings had become the house rules, right? So if Dogen's authoritative, then his temple ought to be the one on the top, right? So there's a lot of positioning, a lot of jockeying for position. So Sojiji argues, well, Keizan has established the use of the ring. And Eihei-ji says, well, the ring is Chinese, it's not in accord with Dogen's teachings, and also the rakusu isn't really an abbreviated robe, and that's not in accord with Dogen's teachings either. So, right, back and forth. So traditionally, of course, monks had 3 robes. They had a 5-panel okesa, they had a 7-panel okesa, and they had a 9. Dogen said you always had to have 3 robes. So Eihei-ji argues rakusu is not a replacement for the 5-panel okesa. In the late 19th century, finally they reach an agreement. Each temple is going to do whatever it wants, and the two styles are going to coexist. All right, so there's not going to be one broad pronouncement. This gets further refined over time. So this is the starting point, right? So eventually the Rakusu does replace the 5-panel okesa. And so these are the compromises. The Rakusu replaces the 5-panel okesa, but the 7 and the panel and the 9 panel are not going to have a ring. So also the size now is going to be based on this arm length, which we still do today, right, if we're making robes. So these were the compromises that sort of let Soto Zen as an institution stay together, right? Because there's factions and everybody's fracturing and taking a different position. So these are the compromises that at least let that community stay together. So I think we can't ignore the likelihood that these two sides become entrenched, not because they're particularly interested in the robe, but because their styles were being challenged, right? There was some ego stuff going on. Your practice style is challenged. It's unclear where authority comes from. This is an opportunity to sort of dig in, right? Draw a line in the sand. So all of this is the backdrop for Sawaki Roshi's nyoho-e movement in the 20th century. So we need to understand all of that, and this is what he's stepping into. So it's bigger than just a dispute between the two head temples of Eheji and Sojiji. It's a question of what has authority, artwork, artifacts, antique robes, or vinaya and texts and written materials. Which one of these things is authoritative? And of course, there's no clear, easy answer for that. That's an old scholastic question, kind of no matter what your topic is. So Sawaki Roshi's general biography, as I say, is available. There were but within that biography, there are several encounters with the robe that are particularly important for him, sort of shaping his experience with this, shaping his worldview with this. Several things happen that keep putting robes in front of him as something he really aspires to investigate, to learn more about. So one is, in his late teens, he goes to study with a teacher, Fueoka Ryoun, who he thought really embodied Dogen's teachings. This guy is a real teacher. This guy is carrying something which is meaningful and interesting that I want to know more about. So this is where he really picks up what we call zazen is good for nothing. So Sawaki, you may know, was a really competitive guy. This zazen is good for nothing was a really important, challenging teaching for him. Right? It really sunk in. It really struck him as an important teaching. So Sawaki Roshi follows his teacher, follows this guy, to various temples for 1.5 years until he's drafted into the army in 1900, and he has to give that up. So he really believes in this guy. He's following him around. So meeting Fueoka was his first encounter with nyoho-e. He noticed this teacher was wearing a robe which was substantially different than the other robes he'd seen. It was unusual in the fabric. It was unusual in the construction. It was not worn like the other robes that he had seen. He didn't know anything about nyoho-e at that time, but he sees this robe and it makes a huge impression on him, and he says, I want to wear one myself one day. I want to figure out what's going on with that. So Fueoka gives Sawaki Roshi some private lectures on some of Dogen's more important works, Gakudo Yojinshu and Ehishingi. And then Sawaki Roshi says, that's great, but please, please teach the Shobogenzo. And he's told, well, in order to really understand Dogen's teachings, first you have to study Buddhism in general. So Sawaki takes that advice. He goes to study at some various different Buddhist schools. This is what leads to the second important nyoho-e encounter. So in 1908, he's 28 years old. He's finishing his Buddhist training and education after the war, and he visits a temple of, guess who? Jiunonko. He sees the robes. You remember the 1,000 robe project over 40 years. He sees the robes that were made, and because they're stored there in the temple. So over the years then, he goes back there. Whenever he's got a question about robes, he goes back to look at those robes, to study them again, right? When he has something he needs to figure out. At the same time, he also goes to a funeral where he meets 2 Shingon nuns who were wearing nyoho-e, which was similar to Fueoka's. And he looks at that and says, I've seen that before. That's interesting. He only really has time to ask these nuns, what lineage are you? Where do you come from? And turns out they're 4th generation from Jiunonko, right? So again, the universe is putting this thing in front of him and saying, this is important. Now he knows enough to look at those robes and go, I'm seeing the pattern. I see that there's something going on. So ultimately, these nuns invite him to come and lecture in their place on Buddhism and Dogen. And for 7 years, once a week, he goes there and he does a lecture about things like the Zuimonki and the Gakudo Yojinshu. And as he's going along, one day the nuns bring him one of Jiyunonko's texts and say, please lecture on this. So he looks at this text and thinks, not a problem. This is pretty accessible. This won't be difficult. I mean, they're talking about robes. Come on, right? How hard can this be? And then he very quickly sees, I don't know what this means. He starts reading this text and thinking, I have no clue. That's interesting. So he has to study nyoho-e. In order to give these talks, he has to really dig into this. How do we wear these things? How do we practice with them? How do we make them? So the nuns teach him to sew robes. So this, of course, is a major turning point for him. So I think it's really interesting as a Dharma teacher. You're presented with something you have to explain. And then you have to figure it out, right? When I was doing the talks on the 108 Gates of Dharma Illumination, I didn't choose those things. The universe was putting them in front of me, and I went, I don't know what that means. So I can sympathize with him. Somebody says, please tell us about this, right? Oh my gosh. It opens up a whole area of study for him, right? So not only does he have to study texts, he actually learns to sew the robes. So interesting. So now he's encountered the physical nyoho-e. He's encountered people who are actually wearing this thing, practicing with this thing. He's encountered Dogen's teachings and texts, right? Because he's done some study. So now he's got pieces are starting to come together for him. Oh, okay. There's multiple sources. There's multiple sources of authority about this, right? So a little while ago I said the foundation of the dispute over robes during that reform movement was a question about who has authority. Artifacts, artworks, old robes themselves, Vinaya, texts, written sources. So this is still at play. So when you read what Sawaki Roshi himself says about these early encounters with the robe, you realize that that question is really alive for him. It's like still, all these hundreds of years later. That is still a live question. He's done plenty of scholarship. He looks at this text. He says that plenty of scholarship was not enough. There's a lot here I don't understand. So when he realizes that he can't understand this text that the nuns have given him, he says, at that time, since I had dictionaries for philosophy and Buddhism, I tried hard to use these to look up words, but I could not understand the text at all. I realized the study of Dharma clothing must begin with the study of Buddha statues. In general, I did not understand the actual kesa. I asked the nuns, and they knew nothing about kesa scholarship, but they knew the physical kesa well. So this time I asked questions of the nuns. Right? So he's building up his resources. Studying statues becomes an important part of his research, right? Three-dimensional. Not even, a drawing is good, but a statue is three-dimensional. So he's looking at these things. He's also working his connections to get access to those antique robes and see how they were made, to look at them in person, look at them carefully. This was not an academic project for him, despite the fact that he later goes on to, teach in university. This was not an academic project for him. This was very much about body, speech, and mind. So this was a deep personal dharma or practice connection for him, right, with the robe. It wasn't just a thing he made. There was a really deep practice going on for him. So the other major 20th century figure, of course, in the nyoho-e movement was Hashimoto Eko Roshi, who is important to the Dainin Katagiri lineages in North America. So he and Sawaki Roshi studied together with Oka Sotan, and they were studying Dogen. So in the early 20th century, it's not easy to get access to commentaries, texts about robes, books about robes. It's a sort of a scholarly niche. Not a lot of people are working on that. Materials aren't widely published. Many of them are only available in Chinese and academic Chinese. So this is not easy to research. So together, Sawaki Roshi and Hashimoto Roshi published some earlier instructions and commentaries by the people who were involved with these robe reform discussions. So they're instrumental in putting these things out for people, making them available to people. They were also speaking publicly. They were writing their own articles about these things. They were encouraging people to sew nyoho-e and to wear them according to these texts and studies. So you can see where they're really starting to share this with people. They're starting to become resources for people. So in 1931, Sawaki Roshi gives a lecture series on one of these texts. Come to find out, the hall was filled 600 people a day. So clearly people care about what he's doing, or they're interested in him, right, as a teacher. At the same time, he's also doing practical instruction on, technical instruction, right, on robe sewing. So he repeats that same series later in the year. Now we see he's reaching a significant audience. He's becoming a very popular speaker. He's a public figure. People know who he is. Momentum is gathering, right, in this movement. His students start publishing a journal of his talks and his public appearances. This is, of course, before websites, before the internet. The way to get that out was to publish something, right? So as a result of his lectures then, nuns start sewing okesa. Donors get excited about this, raising money for the cloth for all these okesa. So now there's a real movement happening. There's something really interesting and exciting happening here. So certainly, Sawaki Roshi spent time practicing in temples, teaching in temples. But as we know, homeless Kodo, right? He never settled down for the long term in any one of those temples. So his spreading of nyoho practice was mainly done outside the established temple system. He was teaching lay people to sew, right? This was not something which was only within a sort of a restricted area. Hashimoto Roshi, on the other hand, was doing his work to establish this practice inside the Sanmon Soto with novices. So we have these two prongs happening, right? So Sawaki Roshi is working with people outside the temple system. Hashimoto Roshi is working with people inside the temple system. Now we've got some interesting interaction, right? This is a broad-based movement. So nyoho-e, of course, were not the only kind of robes available. Back in the day, I'm sure in Buddha's day, you know, you sewed your robe because you couldn't get out your credit card and call up the company and order one, right? But at this point, nyoho-e are not the only robes available. So there were and are commercial businesses making okesa for sale. This is one of them. So this gold one behind me is a commercial okesa. That one over there is nyoho-e. So afterwards, if you want to come up and look at them, you can see how they're differently made, right? The fabric is different, the construction is different. So this difference becomes a bone of contention in the world of Soto Zen. You have some people making robes for sale, you have some people making nyoho-e. So to Sawaki Roshi, the way he defines nyoho-e, it's made by hand, it's using the kakushi backstitch as indicated in the Vinaya, it's made with a mind of faith, preferably by the person who's wearing it. And on that basis, he said, commercial robes are not real robes, right? So now we have this question again. Is this Buddha's robe or not? So of course, the commercial businesses are not happy with him either because he's criticizing, cutting into their livelihood. They're not thrilled with this. It takes time and a certain kind of attitude to make nyoho-e, and as a business, they're not willing to make them that way. They need to make them quickly and get them out to people. So it's a completely different approach. So Sawaki Roshi says in his characteristically blunt way, those without belief, without heart, without intelligence, and without connection to the Buddha Dharma make something that resembles kesa. But the kesa made by businessmen without heart just imitate kesa. They are merchandise. Since commercial robe makers have no connection to belief at all, they just regard the idea of making each robe imbued with one's spirit as the sleepy talk of an idiot. So, back in the 1700s, those who were studying the kesa were mainly concerned with figuring out what the proper form was, according to the Vinaya. No one was saying that only a mind of faith could make a real okesa, right? They were mainly concerned with what's it made out of and what's the form of it, and right? Here comes Sawaki Roshi saying, yes, and, right? You need a mind of faith if this is really going to be nyoho-e. He's taking a new perspective on this practice, and he says the teaching or practice and the form have to be aligned. These things have to be in alignment. You can't do one and not the other and have a real robe. So he's saying even if these businesses took the time to backstitch these robes by hand, they still wouldn't be authentic because these are just things for sale, right? This is just merchandise. So it wasn't a practice of reverence for commercial people making robes, right? And of course, it's not just the commercial robe makers who are objecting to this movement, right? Sotoshu itself is not happy. It's saying, well, promoting this nyoho-e practice is disruptive to our rules. You're creating dissension, right? It says to Sawaki Roshi, you have to stop teaching the nuns to sew. I mean, can you imagine? And it's not like that's a big public pronouncement. They just like let it be known. This is not okay with us. You can't teach the nuns to sew. It also sends somebody, a representative, to the nuns' actual study center to warn them that the nyoho-e is a violation of the 1889 Unified Rules of Dress in the Soto School. Right? So the other thing that happens is that Hashimoto Roshi has been publishing articles about nyoho for a long time. Those stopped appearing after about 1940. So clearly there's a move to shut this down. So what's happening here, of course, is nyoho-e movement is seen as disruptive to this compromise that had been worked out between Eheiji and Sochiji, right? What are the robes going to look like and who's in charge and all that stuff, right? Here comes Sawaki Roshi and his movement, and he's disrupting. He's a disruptor. So there was never any kind of written statement or regulation prohibiting nyoho-e. Of course, we still see them today, right? They coexist along with commercial robes. So there was never an official, you cannot, but it was clearly known. They let it be known. This was not okay. So not only does Sawaki Roshi disagree with the commercial robe makers and with Sotoshu, he also disagrees with some of the earlier scholarship, because of course he's reading all these things, right, and investigating all these things. And he says, well, those scholars were simply studying those texts as texts. They liked the literary style, they enjoyed doing the study, digging into the texts and looking at what they had to say, but they didn't understand the okesa, and heck, they didn't even wear it properly. Like, how would he know that? But okay. They're not even wearing it properly. So for him, unless, again, the study of text is deeply, deeply connected to making, receiving, wearing, doing that with a mind of reverence, doing that, taking that on as a practice, then the whole undertaking, he says, is not authentic. So a sort of divide exists now between the nyoho-e people and the Sotoshu people, and nonetheless, all the people that had been taught all this time by Sawaki Roshi and Hashimoto Roshi continue to write articles, they continue to write instructions, make these things available. They turn some of the more complicated texts into diagrams that were easier to understand. So if you've ever made a rakusu or an okesa, there's lovely diagrams today. Or if you look at Echukuma's book on the website, there's lovely diagrams today. Now these things are starting to be simplified, or if not simplified, diagrammed and explained. Right? So some of those texts sort of are underground. It's not something you can publish and put on a bookshelf. They might be shared privately, but they're around and they're being circulated. So nyoho practice survives in small groups of lay people or ordained people. It doesn't go away, but. So today, nyoho-e are not the official robes of Sotoshu. Despite the hopes, the original hopes, particularly on the part of Hashimoto Roshi, that at some point these things would become the official robes. They're not. So my own compromise is when I'm here, I wear the robes of our family, the robes that our ancestors would want me to wear. And I help my students to do the same. When I go to an official Sotoshu something, or I need to work with Sotoshu officials, then I wear the regulation commercial okesa. I wear a rakusu with a ring, right? I do as I'm asked to do. But if you look around the room at a Sotoshu conference in North America, there are a lot of nyoho-e. Those folks are not all in commercial robes. It's not easy to get a commercial robe in this country, right? You have to mail order it. I mean, you can't just go down to the store and buy one, right? So they're not inexpensive either. So a lot of folks will make the decision to not do that, to not have one. And I think, in my experience, many North American clergy may not even be aware that there's this historic friction between commercial robes and nyoho-e, right? Well, it's all a robe. So they may not even be aware. Even though, whenever we get the packet for the conference, and it says on the agenda, wear rakusu with a ring, it actually tells us wear rakusu with a ring, because otherwise we probably won't. So, right? So by now there's sort of an assumption, I think, in North America that ordaining or taking lay precepts means you sew a robe. It's just an integral part of that process. It's just what you do, and perhaps it's always been that way, and perhaps it's that, that way everywhere. That's not at all true in Sotoshu in general. Probably when you were at Kotaiji, there were a lot of people not in nyoho-e. You were the only one?
No, I said almost everyone who wasn't from the West.
Yeah. Yep. So, in fact, I was told years ago, if you arrive in a Senmon Soto wearing a nyoho-e, you might be seen as kind of uppity. All those uppity people making their own, like, what's the point? Are they poking the bear? What are they doing? Because it's pretty unusual in some places. I didn't have that experience because everywhere I ever trained actually had the nyoho-e tradition. We actually were making them in the places where I was, so I didn't have that experience, but I've been told. So how are they even seen today? There's a little bit of that divide, right, still going on. So for me, fortunately, nobody objected. In fact, I was usually the one teaching those boys to sew, so nobody minded. So in any event, because we are direct descendants of Sawaki Roshi, it feels important for us to know this story. There's a lot more people can dig into here. I've given you the high points, but there's lots and lots of context that you can dig into around that. And Sotoshu history and the whole reform movement is really important for us. So it's useful for us to understand how critical it was to Sawaki Roshi that we really connect, study, and practice, right? Studying the text is important, studying the Vinaya is important, looking at the diagrams and all that is important, and also what's equally important is making these robes, receiving them properly, wearing and caring for them properly. That is also an important practice. So the study doesn't end when we put the book down, right? Or we finish sewing the rakusu and we receive that or something. That's not the end of that story. We're going to wear that robe forever and ever. So that study, in a way, is just beginning. Now we're beginning the study with the body, right? How do we wear them? How do we carry them? So it's important for us also to have this context in North America because I think we're still sort of a frontier when it comes to Soto Zen practice. Really, practice hasn't been around here very long. We're still learning. We're still putting the pieces in place. In many ways, I think we don't know what we don't know. Until we go to a Senmon Soto, in some ways, we don't know what we don't know. So we see commercial robes. We see nyoho-e. We see handmade robes being adapted in North America for different materials, different colors, people's personal stories. Right? So it's good to understand the distinctions, that there are distinctions, and what those are. And then we can make choices for ourselves that feel appropriate. So if we're engaged in sewing rakusu or sewing okesa, we also need to know which things we can appropriately take as models. Because if we look around, we see a lot of styles, a lot of colors, a lot of things happening. So in this particular family, given our particular ancestors, it's important that we know what can I look at as a model. Not that other things are not authentic robes, but in this family we do things a certain way. So like what can I be looking at? These things are not craft projects. They are not sort of artistic expressions of our own personal whatever, right? There actually isn't a lot that we get to decide about how we make them or wear them or carry them or handle them, right? There's a lot there that's not about our personal decision. There's a lot there that's about folding into the tradition, sort of letting go of ego. So when we hear the story, when we see the larger context, I think it's clear why we undertake sewing with a mature, experienced teacher. We don't just go online and download some instructions and make something out of whatever we have, right? Because the practice piece is so important. We really need teachers who can embody that and transmit that and so we carry that on. It's not just a matter of, do I know how to thread a needle and sew a seam, right? There's something bigger going on. So to do that in concert with a teacher and a group of kaite that are also undertaking that as a practice and taking it very seriously as a practice is what Sawaki Roshi is asking us to do, right? So it isn't a matter of getting the credit card and calling up and ordering a robe, right? That's a particular thing. He's saying there's something else happening that we need to be aware of. The process itself is important. Everything from cutting the fabric to actually receiving that robe at a ceremony, that entire process is practice. It is not a means to an end. It's not a production line where I'm doing this in order to, right? I'm going to get an outcome at the end. We do get an outcome at the end, but the process in the middle is practice, and that's important. So I think this practice of sewing, receiving, wearing is really seamless, and it doesn't end. So I was saying to Sawyer the other day, I've read that like from the moment you cut the fabric, that thing is a robe. So how we even treat the pieces, how we even treat while we're constructing it, how we treat that, it's not just a pile of fabric pieces, right? As soon as you cut the first piece, that thing is Buddha's robe. So understanding Sawaki Roshi's nyoho-e practice, I think also gives us a window into the history of the Soto Zen denomination, which is also useful context for us. So it helps us answer one tiny part of this question about why do we practice the way we do today? If we don't ask ourselves that question, I think we risk kind of wandering away from what our ancestors were teaching without really being aware of it. You know, now we're back to we don't know what we don't know. So to go back and look at that context and kind of understand the trajectory and understand the direction and why our teachers are telling us certain things is really important. You may know that next year, I'm thinking the practice theme, this year we're doing tangible thusness, and we're talking about nyoho. Next year for our practice theme, I'm thinking we're going to do the world of Soto Zen. So we're going to really dig into some of the context and the history about this. So this is one window into that larger story. And of course, also, the robe is one gateway, one window into this larger study and practice of nyoho as a tangible thusness, right? So what would you all like to say about robes, about history, about Sawaki Roshi? This is a part of his story that we maybe hear a little bit less than we hear his war experiences and his traveling around. So let me start with people here. Things people would like to say in the room. Things to add to that story, questions about that story, reactions, please.
Can you repeat what you said when Dogen said that Buddha's robe is not yet, or is not.
The true robe has not yet arrived in Japan.
So, and the true robe is?
The robe that has no characteristics.
So, therefore, no robe is true, since all robes have characteristics.
And also robes don't have characteristics.
The true robe doesn't.
The true, well, sure. So we have form and emptiness, right? He's saying don't fall down on one side and ignore the other side.
I was thinking something that Joseph Campbell said, that there is transparency to transcendence. So that when a symbol, when you encounter a symbol, the symbol is an indicator of something beyond itself. But if you close it off, so it's no longer transparent. So if the symbol itself becomes the object, becomes a thing, and not that which is transcended or indicated by the symbol, then you have a kind of an idol worship. And can you have a kind of an idol worship about thinking your robe without understanding the transcendent attributes thereof?
Sure, we can be incredibly attached to these robes, and we can imbue them with all kinds of meaning and stories, and we can really be quite precious about it and not understand that it is a robe with characteristics, and it is also the formless field of merit, right? So we have form and emptiness and going beyond a distinction. So like any other practice, any other artifact of our practice, right? So we can see this just for what's right here, and we can see this for only the robe that has no characteristics, but how do we practice in the middle with these two realities, right? That's our challenge. So they're all true. They're both true.
So the commercial case, but are there commercial roxins?
Sure, that's what this is. Oh, that's what Esho's is.
Well, I sewed this one, and this has a ring.
Yes, you have a hybrid. I don't. It's
well, I have two. I have one that's sewed here without the ring, and this one I would furnish.
Well, and there are streams and sects that do sew them with a ring. It just so happens in this particular family, because of our particular lineage, we sew them without the ring. But yes, there are people. I have made them for people and put rings in them because I know that it's the only way they can wear it, right? But we don't do that here.
You maybe can't speak to this, but years ago, when I got my first rakusu with Myoyu, John McCrae was at that entire week that we were sewing rakusu. And I remember having a long conversation with him about how the rakusu came about. And I've always kind of been curious because it made sense what he was telling me, but it also sounded like he didn't really know. But the idea was that somehow in China, at some point when Buddhists were being persecuted,
yes.
They needed a way to shove it out of the sight really quickly. So
yep, that story is there. Well, and I'm not saying story in a dismissive way. That point of view is up there. So yes, when the emperor decided Shintoism was the thing and Buddhism was not the thing, then folks needed a way to wear a robe but not wear it conspicuously. And a small one supposedly you put inside your clothing. Now today we would say you can't put anything on top of that, but okay. Desperate times call for desperate measures. So yes, there is one point of view that says they were created so you could put them inside your clothing and not be seen. Yeah.
Okay, all right, thanks.
Which I think doesn't, so, yeah, anyway, yes. But that's why I say there's lots of things we can delve into. Yeah. But there's not one clear origin story, so that's part of the story. Please.
Couple questions. I've never seen a robe unfurled.
Oh, and that's probably why I put them on. So for folks at home, you can't see at this moment, but I have two robes hanging behind me. The gold one here is the commercial one, and the blue one over there is the nyoho. And partly I did that because often, unless you wear one or you've made one, you don't ever see them completely unfold. You see them on bodies or folded up in a pile.
And then I was just wondering, how many hours does it take to sew?
Oh, glory. Well, if you're doing
Days.
if you're doing a robe sewing retreat where like that's your thing, you can do one in a week, especially if you've made them before. How long did it take you? How many years?
6.
6 years. How long did it take you?
Maybe a year and a half.
Yeah. So
I think I went with 6.
so it depends, like everything else. How much time can you put in? How quickly do you sew? We need to have the attitude that says we're working steadily, but it shouldn't be hurry, slapdash, right? So, so it's not. It might seem like this huge kind of 1,000 robes in 40 years project, but as you see, it's quite achievable. So, I think this one I made in about 2 weeks. I think yours I made in about 2 weeks. The
In
one
2 weeks?
Sagan's wearing, yeah. Because I just said, that's the one I'm gonna do for 2 weeks, and I said, that's only a 7 row and it's not complicated, so, yeah.
So how long does it take you, your first one?
Probably something like a year and a half. I mean, because you don't know how to do it, And also, at the time, the teacher I was sewing with was in Iowa, and I was in Minnesota, and so I was having to travel, right? So there's all kinds of karmic circumstances around that. Here we're fortunate because if we're sewing here, we have people who can help us and teach us, and we can do it. We can get together once a week, and we can sew at home and get questions answered. But if you're in a situation where you don't have those resources, it can take longer. Yeah. But the point of that project is not to that is not a needlework project. That is a practice, right? So people shouldn't be fearful about, I've never threaded a needle before. That's not the point of that thing. Did you have other questions?
One just popped up for me.
Yeah.
At least with the blue one, I think it's hard to see. It seems like just looking at this one here on the gold one, there are patches that are sewn together, right? There are seams.
Yes, this one also has.
That also has.
Yeah.
So
with the 7 panel, there's 2 long ones and a short one, and then the next row is the short ones on the bottom and 2 long ones. So there's 21 actual pieces, chosen times. I have heard that one of the interesting things about the long ones and the short ones is there's more long ones than short ones, and so that's about, not longevity, but aspiration or something. There's more good because there's more long ones. But yeah, so I mean, we can talk later about how this one is made. This one is not made exactly like these because the fabric in there, I was given that fabric, which was hand woven by somebody's grandmother in Japan. I didn't have enough to do 7 panels. I only had enough to do, I think, 3. So I had to use a different technique. I wanted to cut it as little as possible because that was all of that I had. But story for another day. All right, please.
I think I've heard of a case of this not with patches. Is that?
Yeah.
It's just like a big.
Yes, folded.
Frame around.
Folded and folded, but not cut. Yes, there is such a thing. Yeah, I'm sure if you look at Kuma's book online, it probably has a diagram of one of those. But yes, yeah, this one actually is not folded. The panels are straight panels, and I've appliqued the yos on them because I only had a certain amount of fabric. Yeah, that's also a technique. And the rakusu that Todo-san is wearing is a different kind of technique as well, right? That's an applique. So folks at home, you can't see it, but he's got a 2-tone rakusu with the yos that are a different color, right? I have one too, and Yuko said, please don't wear that here because people look at that and then they email me and say, I want to make one like that because that's pretty. Not an art project. We make those that way because we've only got a limited amount of fabric. If you only have this much fabric, you can't cut it into pieces. You have to applique something over it because that's all you have. But there's a reason to do that.
So Glassman did one of tie-dye, is that blasphemy?
It's not nyoho. Well, it depends. What color?
He did sew it.
What? It depends, I suppose, on what color it was.
Well, it was tie-dye, it was multicolored.
It was fuchsia, then not nyoho. Doesn't mean it wasn't Buddha's robe, but not nyoho. Other things in the room? Please.
I could share a few little.
Please. Yes.
anecdotes.
Please share what you've experienced.
So at Zuyoji, I remember one day there was someone coming from Eiheiji for some reason, I can't remember. And the sort of most senior of the training monks went around and gave all of us, so I think among the training priests, it was only the foreigners that had nyoho-e robes.
Probably.
All of the Japanese training monks. Except for some of them, we would sew rakusu there, like if you were there for any length of time. So most of the Japanese had nyoho-e rakusu, but not okeso. So anyways, he announced that someone from Eiheiji was coming and walked around with these like little tiny boxes, and he's like, here, you need this. And I open it up and it's a little ring.
It's a ring.
With a pin.
Ah!
And so you literally just pin it to the strap of your nyoho-e rakusu, so it looks like it has a ring, but it's just pinned on.
That's great.
And then
What a compromise. You gotta love that.
and then once the person left,
You had to get the ring back?
Yeah, I guess they didn't have a stock of those for exactly that occasion.
Yeah.
That is funny.
And then I guess the other sort of interesting maybe moment is, so we would sew a rakusu there, so I sewed one when I was there. And most of the people the foreigners that go there are European from the Deshimaru lineage, who is also sort of
Our cousins.
weird way connected to Kodo Sawaki. But when we sew rakusu here, we actually do the Hashimoto Roshi style because it's through what's his name? Kodo Roshi's lineage. The abbot of Zuyoji is also through that lineage from Hashimoto Roshi. So they sew pretty much exactly the same way as Tomoe Kadagiri's book describes. But the Europeans all sew in the Kodo Sawaki style for the rakusu, which is kind of different from the way that we do it. Like the border is different. They sort of sew it onto the main face continuously rather than making a loop first. Which I don't know if that's their own thing or what, but it was funny because all the Europeans had to sort of learn new things about how to sew in the style of that temple, but for me and a couple of the other Americans, it was exactly what we were familiar. So it was interesting, that feeling of kind of the lineage,
Yeah.
being in the same sewing lineage.
And that's an unusual, we don't get to have that experience. That's really, at some point I want to pick your brain about that because that's really interesting. One of my questions has been, I knew there were differences in style, but like how does that play out? And how are they different? And how might that have happened? So you've had an interesting experience of that, because I think in the West, because Mrs. Kadagiri's book is so prevalent, probably most people pick that up and that's what they use. I don't know if, I'm assuming San Francisco is doing the same thing because it all kind of started there, right, in this country. So it would be interesting to see what those differences are, because I'm guessing that Deshimaru style is not so well known here. So I'm actually glad you learned something about that.
So this is what I heard about the Deshimaru style. Deshimaru didn't really have time to teach sewing okesa because he died quickly. So after he passed away, like disciples kind of like started, maybe this is how you make it. But I think he had some of the stuff was commercial made, so that his Deshimaru style zabu is always commercial style, which is not nyoho.
Right.
So
That's
so it's
interesting.
kind of like the European sewing style. It's kind of like mixed up and confused, and then they made the instruction from, French people started making the instruction. So it's kind of confusing and.
That's interesting. Okay, because yeah, that clears up some things for me.
Yeah, me
So-
too, because I've noticed that they all have
Right.
the zagu with the
Zagu
white.
With the
cross.
white,
Yeah.
yeah. Oh, that's interesting. So it might be that what you saw was not something Sawaki Roshi himself would have taught. It might have
Yeah.
been something that was developed afterwards in a moment of need. Because, you have to do what you have to do, right? That's really interesting. Other things in this room? Gosh, I'm glad we brought this up because now I'm learning stuff. Other things in this room? Please,
It's
Jeff.
just a observation, reflection, is that I'm pretty sure it was after I'd sewn my Raksu and gone through the steps that you described, but the first time I saw you put an adornment pin. This is the confession part. I didn't know what to make of it. I didn't know how to look at this. And then there was another pin. And
Right.
now I discovered I just always like seeing it, and it's.
Right, so we have to be careful of what we pin onto a Raksu, right? So the pins that you see on mine are Baika pins, which Sotoshu gives me, so that's where they go. I can't just sort of put my grandmother's diamond brooch on there. I have to be careful about what, so a name tag is acceptable, Baika pins are acceptable. And occasionally Sotoshu will, there's a pin for one or other particular kind of thing, and you'll see those, right? But yeah, we have to be careful that doesn't become a canvas, right? With those Baika pins, if you it's not like you put on every Baika pin you ever get. You have to put the highest ranking one, but you take the other ones off, right? So yeah, this can't be like when you're in the Scouts and you've got a banner. Yeah,
That was one of the first
yeah.
experimental reactions to it, is that it was like a Scout's badge.
Well, it can be like that, right? And so I think if you're in a place that's not a Sotoshu place, you don't see that so much. Maybe you do, I don't know. But yeah, we have to be careful that what goes on there is a name tag during the conference. Something that Sotoshu has given you. So I confine all of mine to what I call my Baika Raksu, and so I've got those on there, but I don't put them on all at once. Yeah, interesting, isn't it? Jewelry. Folks at home, questions, comments from you? I'm gonna, Will's gonna help me facilitate, so if I don't see you, he's gonna poke me and say, somebody. I know there's a few folks out there who have some Raksus and may have something to say. And if not, that's all right too. Okay? Anything from anybody else?
I do have one
Please.
last question. which
You've got
is,
one, and then I think Owen has one behind you, so.
When you were talking about Sawaki Roshi's sort of main factor for deciding whether something is or is not Buddha's robe.
Is or is not nyoho-e?
Well, but didn't you say he said that the commercial Akesa, in his view, is
In
not?
his view, is not nyoho-e.
Yeah, and anyway, the factor that he said there is that if it is sewn with the mind of faith.
Mind of, I didn't use the word faith. What did I say? Mind of,
Well, that's what my question is about. Because if it is faith, I'm wondering why he used the mind of faith rather than the mind of
I have to
practice.
say, I heard that, so.
you heard faith.
Yeah.
Okay, so let me check and just remind myself, because I thought that wasn't at least that wasn't always the word I used.
I thought you said practice.
Mind of faith. I stand corrected with a mind of faith. Okay, so your question is?
Is sort of is there significance to using that word faith in that context? Is it sort of like, we talk about faith sometimes in over the years we've talked about what that means in Soto Zen. And so I'm wondering why he would choose, if he did, to choose that word to describe the sewing of the Akesa. Is there something particularly about our practice of faith or belief or trust or whatever word you want to use that is connected to that, what makes the robe a robe.
Well, so I think there are two potential answers to that. One is that he also says this is a practice of reverence. You know, one of the reasons that the commercial robe is not the nyoho-e is because it's not done with as a practice of reverence, right? So the meaning is different. But I think if we explore, so what is faith about? You know, what do we have faith in? Faith in the three treasures. Well, if you know, so we can have faith that this robe is not different than Buddha, not different than Dharma, right? We can have faith that this is a true robe, the robe without characteristics. You know, what about this robe can we not see? That's where we have to have faith. You know, what about this robe is not about Taishi Kyuryo in the very tangible sense? What about this robe is ineffable? What about this robe is unconditioned? Mind of faith, right? Because if we don't have mind of faith, it's a piece of merchandise, or it's an art project, or it's a personal expression, or it's a piece of clothing. And he's saying, yes, and, right? Also, there's this true robe. Can we see the true robe in this piece of cloth? Right? So from the moment we cut that fabric and we know that's Buddha's robe, well, it doesn't even look like a raksu or an okesa, and yet somehow we have faith that that is Buddha's robe. Somehow that is already the true robe, right? So I think if we come at that project without that understanding, it becomes something else. And then we can have an argument about, is that Buddha's robe or not? Is it possible to have something which is not Buddha's robe? Is that
some
enough
kind of
for
instruction about the sewing, that there's a mindfulness that goes into each stitch, kind of a mantra. I don't remember the exact phrase now, but
Namke-butsu, namke-butsu,
Yeah.
namke-butsu.
It's a
Yes,
statement of faith.
it is a statement of faith. That's true, actually. Well, so there you go. Thank you for tying that together. Namu anything is a statement of faith. So yes, my guess is if we're not selling commercial robes with the backstitch and namke-butsu, we're not coming at it with Sawaki Roshi's mind of faith, and then that becomes something else. Thank you for that. That's important. Owen, did you have something too?
Right. Not to be demanding, it's probably sounds like a bigger question than I mean, but you had mentioned a third sect I'd never heard about.
Obaku?
So, yeah.
You can go and learn about it. So when we think about Zen, generally we think about three. There are more, but generally we think about those three sects: Rinzai, Soto, and Obaku. So you can. So there was some concern during the Reform times that a little bit of Obaku was kind of making its way in, and people were going, "That's not Soto, and it's not okay." But you can go and read about that dynamic. Other things this morning? Okay, so this was pretty concrete in our study of nyoho clothing, but it feels like it was important to have this history. So please, if there's any part of this thing that intrigues you, please dig in. We are working with the challenge that there's so much of Sawaki Roshi's life and material that has never been translated. So as soon as we get new materials, it's really helpful and useful to go look at those things and keep sort of building that context for us, because he's really, really important for our practice. Okay? Let's do our closing chant.